G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of The Footsteps of the Messiah, the study of the last days. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so thank you for coming along. We're into session 3 of the study of the last days, based on the footsteps of the Messiah. Just quickly, we're into the times of the Gentiles here. The times of the Gentiles began with the Babylonian captivity of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. It will go right down until the time of the Messianic kingdom, when the Messiah comes and rules. Times of the Gentiles, it's a time where Jerusalem is dominated by Gentile powers. Now, there are short intervals in between where the Jews do have control of Jerusalem, but they'll always be temporary. Even today, we see that Jerusalem is not in total control of Israel. And in the future, we will see that she'll again be overrun and be controlled by the Gentiles. We looked at 2 passages last session. We looked at Daniel chapter 2, 31 to 45, where we had Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the interpretation. And then we saw Daniel chapter 7, verse 1 to 28, which we had the 4 visions of Daniel and the interpretation. Now, in those two passages there, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he saw an image, a head of gold, arms, chest of silver, a belly of brass, legs of iron, with part clay, part iron down in the toes. And we saw a stone which was cut without hands, which is divine stone, which is the Messiah, striking that image on the feet. And we know from what we saw in history and later on that the 4 empires that we saw there were the Babylonian Empire, followed by the Medo-Persians, followed by the Greek or the Hellenistic Empire. And then we had an empire, which was the 4th empire. Now, there was no description given by them, but we call it the Empire of Imperialism. Now, it starts off with the Roman Empire, but it then splits into two divisions, which is where we are today. We're in the 2-division stage today, and that will go into the one world government system. Then that will go into the 10 kingdoms around the world. Finally, ended up in the Antichrist being the ultimate dictator of the earth. So tonight we're going to knock off the other 2 passages, which is Revelation 13 verses 1 to 10 and Revelation 17 7 to 14, and this will encapsulate the times of the Gentiles. So the 4th empire in Revelation 13 1 to 10, this is where we are, the 4th empire, which is the empire of imperialism, we call it. It's the Antichrist stage in chapter 13, verse 1 to 10. We get some information here. So this is the 3rd passage. Now, Revelation 13 is completely focused upon the 4th empire, which we term the empire of imperialism. And it emphasizes a particular stage of the 4th empire, which is the 5th and last stage, the Antichrist stage. Now, as we're only looking at the times of the Gentiles here, so we're just going to focus on a couple of verses. Verses 1 to 2, verse 1 says, "And he stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns 10 diadems, and upon his heads names of blasphemy." Now, John describes this beast that comes up out of the sea. Remember, the sea in Revelation 13 is the same as the one in Daniel 3, which represents the Gentile world. It's the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea, which represents the Gentile world. This beast, now remember, Daniel didn't give us a description of this 4th beast. It was nondescript, but here we have a description. It says it's coming up out of the sea, and it has 10 horns, 7 heads. Now, the 10 horns we found in Daniel 7, and they represent the 10 kingdoms. Remember, the 10 kingdoms is the 4th stage of what we termed the empire of imperialism, which is the 4th Gentile empire. Now, these 10 kingdoms, this is a 10-division stage. Remember, we see the 10 toes and the 10 horns in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. will continue right down to the fifth stage, which is the Antichrist stage. Now, the difference between the two stages is that the fourth stage, the world is divided into 10 kingdoms, ruled co-equally by 10 men. While in the fifth stage, the world in all 10 divisions is ruled by the Antichrist, and the other kings are subject to him. Now, in this description here, we see something completely new, 7 heads. We'll see that in Revelation 17 when we get there. Now, just quick recap. Remember, the fourth empire started off as a united stage, which is the Roman Empire stage. Then it split into 2 divisions, which is what we say is the east-west balance of power. That's exactly where we are today. That's where we are right now. We're in this east-west balance of power, the 2 stages of the fourth beast. And then we go on from here into a one world government system. And then that splits into 10 kingdoms. And that 10 kingdoms actually then goes into the Antichrist stage. Now, in verse 2, we see a further description here. It says, the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet were as the feet of a bear, his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. So from the Daniel passage, from Daniel 7 passage, we saw the leopard-like body represents the Greek or the Hellenistic empire or influence. The bear-like feet represents the Medo-Persian influence. Lion-like mouth represents the Babylonian influence. So this fourth beast is influenced by the previous 3 empires. Now, back in Daniel chapter 7, verse 12, he wrote, and as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So the dominion of the first 3 empires was taken away because they were conquered by successive empires. However, their lives were prolonged in that they left their influence on the 4th empire. We have been influenced by Greek and by Medo-Persian, by Babylonian, this empire that we're currently in. In Revelation chapter 13, verses 3 to 10, John now concentrates on the 5th and final stage of the 4th Gentile empire. Remember, this follows the 10 division stage, and this is the Antichrist stage. So just an overview of what's happening here, because we're going to cover this in more detail later on. We're simply looking at the times of the Gentiles. In verse 3, and I saw one of his heads as though it had been smitten unto death, and his death stroke was healed. So this chapter 13, verse 3 is describing the death and resurrection of the Antichrist. Remember, we have 7 heads. We have 7 heads here, and one of them is killed, and the death stroke was healed. He was resurrected back to life. Just quickly, remember, Satan has a counterfeit system. Satan is a counterfeit father. Antichrist is a counterfeit son. False prophet is a counterfeit Holy Spirit. And just as Jesus died and was resurrected, the false Christ also dies and is resurrected. That's a freebie. Now, verse 4. And they worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority unto the beast, and they worshiped the beast. Dragon is Satan. So here we see the worship of the Antichrist. In verses 5 to 7, we see the activities of the Antichrist. It says he speaks great things. Verse 5, he reigns with absolute control for 3.5 years. He blasphemes against all heaven. He wars against the saints and the nations. That's his activities of the Antichrist. In verse 8, it says, and all that dwell on the earth shall worship him. Now, the exception is all those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, believers in Messiah Jesus. They do not worship the Antichrist. In verses 9 to 10, we have the warning to those who do worship the Antichrist. Now, what's new in Revelation 13, 1 to 10? The 10 horns we know from Daniel, and now the 7 heads. These haven't been seen before. This is completely new to us, the 7 heads. So that's Revelation 13. Revelation 70, verse 7 to 14. We see the 4th empire, the 7 heads. That's what we're going to concentrate on here, the 7 heads. Verse 7 gives us the composition of the beast. It says 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, this is the same as the one in Revelation 13 and the 4th beast of Daniel 7. They're all talking about the same beast here. We already know what the 10 horns represent. The 10 horns represent the 4th stage of the 4th empire, the 10 kingdoms. The 7 heads is now the focus of Revelation 17. And in verse 8, the beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit. So this here is the death and resurrection of the Antichrist being again described. Now, once again, after the resurrection of the Antichrist, all men worship him except for the saints. The same as Revelation 13. Again, we're going to cover this in more detail later in the study. Now, the 7 heads we see in verses 9 to 10 of chapter 17. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. When he does come, he must remain only a little while. Now, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which are 7 kings. Remember, earlier I mentioned that whenever the word mountain is used symbolically, it is always a symbol of a king, kingdom, or throne. And this is what we're seeing here in verses 9 to 10. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. They are also 7 kings. So the meaning of mountains here is consistent with its symbolic usage everywhere else in the scriptures. Now, John is writing Revelation and he says, 5 are fallen. What's he saying? What he's saying is that 5 of these heads are fallen. They were gone by John's day. They were historical. Then John says, 1 is, meaning it was still present and in control. And the 7th head has not yet come. It was still future to John's day. Now, John lived under Roman rule, and it was also the time of the first stage of the empire of imperialism, the United States, or the Roman Empire stage. So this stage of imperialism represents the 6th head. I know you're probably a little bit confused, but we'll get it. We'll get there. So what we can tell is that these 7 heads, 7 mountains, 7 kings, that's what they are. They're all sequential, one after the other. 5 already fallen, 1 is in John's day, and that 1 still is today, and there's 1 still to come. Now, looking at Roman history, it's known that Rome went through 5 types of governments before it developed into the first stage of the empire of imperialism. The 5 are fallen heads, and they are the Tarquin kings, the consulars, the plebeians, the republicans, and the triumvirate. These are the stages. These represent the 5 heads which are fallen. These are now a part of history, and by the time John wrote his book. Before the 4th Gentile empire of imperialism developed, these 5 types of governments preceded Rome, the Roman Empire. Excuse me. Now, so the 5 were fallen. The 6th head was the one that was then present when John was writing, which began in the year 27 BC and will continue right down into the middle of the tribulation period. So the 6th head, 6 of the 7 heads, the 6th head includes the first 4 stages of the 4th Gentile empire of imperialism. And those 4 stages are the united stage, the 2-division stage, which is where we are today. Following this will be a 1 world government stage, and then the 10 kingdom stage. Now there's one head still to come, and that is the 7th head, which is the Antichrist stage, and that is the stage of absolute imperialism. Once that 7th head is established, he must continue for a little while, namely 3.5 years. He starts in the midpoint of the tribulation till the end. Now, in verse 11, we see the position of the Antichrist. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. Now, this verse could be a bit confusing if we didn't understand the previous passages on the times of the Gentiles correctly. The beast that was and is not is the Antichrist who was killed and resurrected. Now he's an 8th, but an 8th what? This has to do with the 10 horns of verses 12 to 13 of this Revelation 17. He is an 8th horn, but he also belongs to the 7 heads. Now remember, he is the 7th head. He's still future. We're currently in the days of the 6th head. 7th head is still future. He's the final stage of this 4th Gentile empire of imperialism. This is the empires that dominate, this is the times of the Gentiles, the empires that dominate Jerusalem. He is an 8th horn in that he is contemporary with the 10 horns. He's a 7th head, which is sequential, with him being the final head in the line. In verses 12 to 13, we see the 10 horns, and they're contemporary. This is verse 12. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. So these 10 horns represent the 10 kingdoms that is going to come out of the 1 world government system. It is the 4th stage of the 4th Gentile empire of imperialism. These 10 kings are contemporary and they rule together. Now, what we saw from Daniel 7, when the Antichrist begins to take control, he uproots 3 of the 10 horns. Just quickly, for those who weren't here last time, in Daniel 7, Daniel says he sees 10 horns, and then he sees a little horn rising up, the 11th horn. That little 11th horn, that's the Antichrist. Now, here, in what we see here, back from Daniel 7, what we see there is that when the Antichrist begins to take control, he uproots 3 of the 10 horns. What that means is he kills 3 of the 10 kings, and he's leaving 7 for the remainder of the tribulation period. These 7 remaining kings now hand their authority over to the Antichrist. They don't want to get killed. They say, it's all yours. You can have it. Now, the Antichrist, he is contemporary with these 7 horns, making him an 8th. He's killed 3, only 7 left. He's now number 8, no longer number 11. He is an 8th contemporary king ruling over the other 7 kings who have submitted to his authority. But he's of the 7 because he is the 7th head of the sequential or chronological ruling governments. Remember, we had 5 which are fallen. 1 is today, still in power today, and there's 1 to come. The term 7 refers to the heads, while the term 8 refers to the horns. Let me just make something clear, which it might be a little bit confusing. Now, we see in Revelation, we see that the term beast is used in Revelation, right? And sometimes it is used to describe the 4th Gentile empire of the times of the Gentiles as a whole in its fifth final form, the Antichrist stage, while at other times it will be used to actually describe the Antichrist personally as the beast. They're interchangeable because it represents the one entity. The beast is the Antichrist. The Antichrist is the one who is in charge of this final stage of the fourth Gentile empire, the beast. Now, in verse 14 of Revelation 17, we see that the Antichrist is destroyed by the Messiah. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. So here we see that the Antichrist stage is now destroyed by the Messiah. Now, this was the stone that was cut without hands in Daniel chapter 2, which strikes the image on its feet. The feet being the last stage of the fourth Gentile empire. A little bit of a summary. The entire period of the times of the Gentiles is to be composed of four Gentile empires: Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Hellenistic or Greek, and imperialistic. Second, the fourth empire, the empire of imperialism, developed from five previous forms of Roman governments: the Tarquin kings, the first head; the consulars, the second head; the plebeians, the third head; republicans, the fourth head; and the triumvirate, the fifth head. Third, the fourth Gentile empire of imperialism was to undergo 5 stages. First 4 being the United stage, Roman Empire; then the 2-division stage, which is currently the East-West balance of power; then the one world government stage; and then the 10 kingdom stage. These first 4 stages are all the 6th head. This will be followed by the 5th stage, the Antichrist stage, the stage of absolute imperialism, which is also the 7th head. Here's a little schematic image chart. Times of the Gentiles. See, we have destruction of Jerusalem in the temple, 586 BC, Israel taken captive to Babylon. First Gentile empire, head of gold, Babylonian. Second empire, Medo-Persian, silver. Third empire, Hellenistic. That's split into 4 with the 4 generals after Alexander died. You see that's there. Now, the development prelude to the fourth Gentile empire, we have these 5 heads: Tarquin kings, counselors, plebeians, republicans or decemvirs, and the triumvirate. They're the first 5 heads. The 6th head, where we are today, we have encompassing the 6th head. It went from the United stage of the Roman Empire back in 63 BC, first stage. Second stage, 2-division stage, which happened in 364 AD to currently it's a 2-division stage. We're going to see a one world government stage. That's the 10 toes of iron and miry clay. That's the 3rd stage. And then the 10 kingdom stage, which is the 10 horns, the 10 kings, 3 uprooted, leaving 7 who will submit to the 8th horn, the Antichrist. And that's the 4th stage. And then we see the 5th stage of the 4th and final Gentile empire is the Antichrist stage, and that is the 7th head. That's the little horn. He's the 11th horn in relation to the 10, and he becomes the 8th horn after he kills 3 of the 10. And he's then, he'll be destroyed by God, ending Gentile domination of Israel. And then we have the Messianic kingdom. Hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer. All these notes will be, you should have these notes, and they'll be available on the YouTube channel. Now we move into the course of this age, and this is the eschatology of the visible church, the visible church. Now, church age, we had this, I know we haven't had this before, but here it is. The 7 churches is in the church age. This goes from Pentecost right down to the period, right down to the rapture when the church is gone, and we have 7 churches there, which we're gonna look through. So we have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Now, in regard to the eschatology of the visible church, we have certain characteristics here. Now, we're going to see that Revelation chapters 2 to 3 will comprise the 2nd major division. second major division here. Now, this division is the things which are. This is remember back in Revelation chapter 1 verse 19, we had John's description of the entire book, we have the things which are and the things which will be. Now, this division here is the 7 churches which we're going to look at. We're going to have the description of the church age, messages of Jesus to the churches, and we have the first audible statements since Paul at his conversion. Now, this involves the visible church. Now, what's the visible church? Well, the visible church is the local body or local church. That's what, when you're front up on a Sunday, you're looking at the visible church. Now, visible church may have both believers and unbelievers. It includes all those who profess belief, whether they really are or not. Now, the invisible church, that's when you can't see, it's invisible because we don't really know who is a believer or not. The invisible church, it's universal. It is the body of Messiah Jesus. It is composed of all true believers since Pentecost. Sometimes it's called the universal church. And we're going to see that the 7 churches contain some of both the visible and invisible. A third characteristic is that Jesus has something against 5 of these 7 churches and nothing against 2. Also, he finds something good in 6 of these churches, but nothing good in the 7th church. The 7th church is entirely outside of his favor, entirely. Nothing good about it. Now, there are 4 common things in all 7 letters. The first thing in common is that every letter has a description of the Messiah taken from the description of the glorified Son of Man found in chapter 1 of Revelation. Then each description is somehow related to what follows in that particular letter. The second thing in common is that all 7 letters contain the words, I know. I know, I know, I know. 5 times it is, I know your works. Once, I know your tribulation. And once, I know where you dwell. Now, the point being made here is that Jesus is intimately aware of the state of every local church. Everyone. Nothing is hid from him. Third statement common to all 7 letters is he that overcomes, followed by a promise which is somehow related to the particular nature of that church. And then the fourth and final common statement in all 7 letters is the statement, he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So this is an admonition to obedience. The churches are responsible to conform to the demands of these letters. Now, the interpretation of the 7 letters, we see, first we're going to look at the things which is the 7 churches. Now, these 7 churches were 7 real churches to whom John was writing. There were 7 literal churches existing in John's day. There are also 7 different types of churches that existed at that time. All 7 church types exist throughout the church age. Church ages from Pentecost to the rapture. No matter what part of church history one may turn to, he will find all 7 types of churches. Now, promises are always to the church as a whole, not just to one individual church, it's to all the churches. All 7 types of churches will continue to exist until the rapture. And then the believing church is removed while the unbelieving stay behind. And this, we're going to look at this in the historical prophetic interpretation. It's used, that's what we're going to use here, which states that while all 7 types of churches always exist, one type of church dominates a particular era of church history. So these letters present a prophetic picture of the 7 historical periods in which the visible church will develop. And these letters are being written to the 7 churches representative of the whole. Remember, the number 7 represents completeness, fullness. Now, these 7 were chosen because, first of all, because of the particular meaning of their names, and second, because the situation of that particular local church will also be characteristic of a future period of church history. Now, certain statements made to individual churches cannot be true of the strictly local situation, and they must have a far wider meaning, and we'll touch on those as we go through. One example is the promise to keep the church of Philadelphia from the hour of trial, that hour which is to come upon the whole earth. Now, if it was just to that particular church in Philadelphia, that the time is long past that this promise could be kept. Only to that particular church, for that local church no longer exists. Nor can this promise be limited to that type of church, because other types of churches of these 2 chapters will also share in the same promise. The things which are, which we're going to look at the basic outline of these 7 letters. Now, all these 7 letters all follow a basic outline containing 6 items. We have a destination, who it's being written to. We have a description of Jesus. We have a commendation. We have a condemnation. We have an exhortation, and we have a promise. Ephesus, first church. Ephesus, we see this in Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. Ephesus, we see here, we look at this in the prophetic, historic prophetic, as being the Apostolic church, which is a church that goes from AD 30 to AD 100. Now, the destination here we see in chapter 1, verse A, it's of the letter Ephesus. It's Ephesus, which means desired. It represents the period of the Apostolic Church, which began in AD 30, after the coming of the Spirit, and it continued to about AD 100. And that was a time of the death of the last apostle, John, the author of the book of Revelation. Now, Ephesus was a type of church that typified the Apostolic Church. And this is followed by a description of Jesus. It's taken from Revelation chapter 1, verses 13, 16, and 20. It points to the control that he has over the destiny of the churches and his presence within the church. In the commendation we find in verses 2 and 3 and verse 6 of chapter 2. First of all, they are commended for condemning false teachers. Now, in Acts chapter 20, verses 29 to 31, Paul warned the elders at Ephesus that false teachers would come and despoil the church. And by the time Paul wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy, the false teachers had arrived and were causing corruption in the church. And by the time this first letter is written by John, the church at Ephesus had now overcome the problem and resisted the false teachers, and they are now being commended for it. The second thing they're commended for is for hating the work of the Nicolaitans. Now, what are the Nicolaitans? Well, there's nothing in the Bible that says what they are, but the meaning of the word in Greek is rulers of the people. For this meaning, it may imply that this was an attempt to divide and make an unnatural distinction between the clergy and the laity, creating a division in which the clergy exercise rulership over the laity. Now remember, we are all priests unto God. But these Nicolaitans tried to make a distinction. The condemnation is now found in verse 4. They have lost their first love, referring to what? The love of the Messiah and love of the word. The second generation of believers has now grown lax and has become cold. Now, these are the ones who came after the apostles. They did not have the fervor of the first generation, hence there is now condemnation. Now, the exhortation is found in verse 5. They're urged to remember their first love, repent, and return to it. Now, failure will result in the removal of their candlestick, which is the removal of their witness as a church. And the promise is found in verse 7. While the letters are addressed to the churches as a whole, the promises here are all to individuals in the church who overcome the problem of the church as a whole. To the one who does overcome and returns to his first love, there is promised the privilege of eating of the fruit of the tree of life in the eternal order. Now, eating with someone implies fellowship. So the one who overcomes will fellowship with him, with Messiah. And this involves the tree of life. This is a promise of a share in the eternal order. This is the letter to the church of Ephesus, and it is relevant to that particular church. Now, certain things true of this local church were also true of the apostolic church in the second generation stage. In the historical prophetic interpretation, this type of church that dominated this is a type of church that dominated the first period of church history. Here we come to Smyrna. This is the church of the Roman persecution, round about AD 100 to AD 313. This is found in Revelation 2, verses 8 to 11. The destination is in verse 8. It's to the church in the city of Smyrna. Now, Smyrna means myrrh, which is associated with death and embalming. And you find it in John chapter 19, verse 39 to 40. John 19, 39 to 40. So in the historical prophetic interpretation, this becomes a fitting symbol to represent the second period of church history, that of the Roman persecution from about AD 100 to 313. Description of Jesus is in the second part of verse 8, and it's taken from Revelation chapter 1, verses 17 to 18. And here he tells the church that he is the first and the last, and that he himself died and lived again. Now, although he died violently, he nevertheless did live again because of the resurrection. So since many of these people will also die violent deaths, this resurrection is given as one of comfort for them, for they too will live again by way of resurrection. And the commendation is found in verse 9. First, they're commended for having patience in sufferings. They have suffered fiercely, but they endured it patiently. Second, they're commended for enduring the blasphemy of those who claim to be Jews, but they are not and are of the synagogue of Satan. Now, in the local situation, it could refer to a local incident, but we have no confirmation of this. In church history, this may refer to the Romans. Why? Because the Romans considered themselves to be the people of God, with the emperor being a god himself. And so these believers were being persecuted by those claiming to be the people of God, but were not. Now, believers were often killed on the grounds that they refused to sacrifice to the emperor. Now, Smyrna is one of the two churches that Jesus had nothing against. And so there is no condemnation for this church. We have an exhortation in verse 10 and concerns three things. First, they're urged not to fear the things that they're about to suffer. Second, he warns them that they are about to suffer persecution for a period of 10 days. And this probably refers to 10 literal days of persecution in the local situation in which many suffered and died. Again, we don't have the historical confirmation, for we don't have a complete record of church history in this early period of time or of that particular church. So we don't know what the 10 days of persecution were. Third, they're also exhorted not to fear death. For if they die as martyrs, then they shall secure the crown of life, one of the 5 crowns. The promise is found in verse 11. Although they may die violently once, they'll not die the second time, which is the second death. Why? Because they're believers. Now, third church is Pergamum. This is the church of the age of Constantine, around about AD 313 to 600. This is in verses 12 to 17. Now, Pergamum means thoroughly married. It was a major city of idolatry with many temples, one of which was a temple of Aesculapius, containing an idol in the form of a serpent. And this may be what Satan's throne refers to here. Now, in the historic prophetic view, it's the church of the age of Constantine that saw the church married to the state. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire, and the church was now married to the state. And the description of Jesus in verse 12 is taken from Revelation 1:16. This description is one of judgment, especially of that exercised by the word of God. Condemnation is in verse 13. They're commended for not denying the faith. And they single out one of their faithful members, a man called Antipas, who suffered martyrdom for his witness. Now, we don't know anything about Antipas, but this just gives a little bit of a hint of what occurred in the local church at Pergamum. His name actually means against all. It may indicate that he stood against all satanic worship. Now, the war against their faith was being inspired by satanic oppression. And the Pergamum church is said to be dwelling where Satan himself dwells, where Asclepius, the serpent's son, was worshipped. Condemnation we see in verses 14 to 15. Now, first in verse 14. They're condemned for allowing some to hold to the teachings of Balaam. Now, Balaam we find in Numbers chapters 22 to 24. He was a seer of Mesopotamia. He was hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to pronounce a prophetic curse on Israel. Now, he tried 4 times to do that, but God took control of Balaam every time he tried to do that, so that on all 4 occasions, he actually pronounced a blessing on the Jews instead. Now, failing in the cursing of Israel, he now used a different tactic. And what he did was he had the women of Moab and Midian. They were sent out along the borders of where the Israelites were camped to entice the Jewish men sexually. And part of the enticement included the worship of the gods of Moab and Midian. And this worked very well because Israel was cursed and many of them died in a plague. Now, this plot later caused the destruction of the Midianites and the death of Balaam himself. Remember Abrahamic covenant, bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. Now, the teaching of Balaam, what was it? It was encouragement of corruption by intermarriage resulting in fornication and idolatry. In the city of Pergamum, intermarriage with the pagan world was a real problem. Now, with civil and religious life so intertwined, for believers to accept social engagements probably meant some involvement with paganism, with believers being compromised. Now, in the age of Constantine, which is where we are in this particular time frame, the church became married to the state, which eventually resulted in spiritual fornication and idolatry. With the church being the state religion, people all over the Roman Empire were simply being baptized into the church with no personal faith. As a result of that, a massive amount of pagans entered the church, bringing their own pagan practices with them. Idolatry then entered the church as these people added Jesus to the many other gods that they already had. And this led to spiritual fornication and idolatry. What it did was it planted the seeds for what later developed into the Roman Catholic Church. So they were rightly condemned for holding to the teachings of Balaam. Now, the second thing that they're condemned for is in verse 15, they're condemned for permitting the teachings of the Nicolaitans. Remember, Ephesus was commended for not tolerating. Pergamum was condemned for tolerating. It was during this period that a distinction began to emerge between the clergy and the laity, with different sets of laws and regulations for each group. A priestly order was now set up in the church that further corrupted and laid the foundation for what was to follow. The exhortation is found in verse 16. Repent, which is change their minds, and to clean up the church, or it will be judged. The promises in verse 17, it's threefold. First, the one who overcomes is promised hidden manna. Now, Manna in the Old Testament was the food provided for the children of Israel when they departed from the land of Egypt. And so what is being said here is that the person leaving the state church might actually be deprived of his job and welfare, but in spite of what he may be deprived of, God will provide his sustenance. Second, they promised a white stone. Yeah. In the ancient world, when a person was found innocent in a trial, he was given a white stone as a symbol of acquittal. Also, when a person was to be received into the membership of a private club or guild, he would be given a white stone, which was a symbol of his acceptance. So both elements here might be included in this second promise. He'll be acquitted of the guilt of that particular church, and it will be a mark of his acceptance by God. The third promise is that he'll be given a new name written on the stone, which only he will know. Often in scripture, a new name was given to a person after he had overcome certain spiritual problems. And two examples of that is, one is Jacob. Remember, he was given the name Israel after his struggle with the angel in Genesis 32. And another is Abraham, whose name was changed to Abraham in Genesis 17. Now we come to Thyatira, the church of the Dark Ages, around about 600 to 1517 AD, and this is in Revelation 2:18 to 29. Destination is the church of Thyatira, which means continual or perpetual sacrifice. Now, in the historic prophetic interpretation, it becomes a fitting description of the church of the Dark Ages as seen in the Roman Catholic doctrine of the continual sacrifice in the Mass. Roman Catholic theology, when the priest consecrates the wafer and the cup, they are said to become the real body and the real blood of Jesus. That's called transubstantiation. And so he is re-sacrificed each time. The laity were given only the wafer and were refused to the cup because of the belief that the real blood might be accidentally spilled. And so therefore the cup was for the clergy alone. So the distinction between clergy and laity begun by the Nicolaitans had now been brought to fruition. Description of Jesus we see in verse 18 and is taken from Revelation 1:14 to 15. They are symbols of judgment. It is he who is the Son of God, and he alone is to be worshipped. There is to be no addition whatsoever. Commendation we see in verse 19. They are commended for their works of love, faith, ministry, and patience, and that these works were increasing. They were characterized by good works, and so their external appearance was positive. Externally, they were very good. Now, we have a lengthy condemnation in verses 20 to 23. In verse 20 to 21, the condemnation involves the toleration of a woman named Jezebel. Now, there may have been a woman by that name in the local church of Thyatira, but it is highly unlikely. Why? Because the name Jezebel is a Phoenician name, and by this time in church history, the Phoenicians had disappeared as a separate ethnic identity and had simply become part of the Greek-speaking world. Also, Thyatira was not located in Phoenicia, but in Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey. Now, this lends credence to the historical prophetic interpretation. Now, we find that when a woman is used symbolically in scripture, she represents a religious entity. This might be either positive or negative. On the positive side, there is Israel as the wife of Jehovah and the church as the bride of the Messiah. On the negative side, remember there's the woman with the leaven in Matthew 13, and then there's the great harlot of chapter 17, and here we have the woman Jezebel. This is most likely a reference to the Old Testament Jezebel to describe the state of the church in Thyatira. Remember, just as Balaam was used to describe the state of the church in Pergamum, we now have Jezebel being used to describe the state of the church in Thyatira. Now, who is she? What does she have to do? Jezebel was a Sidonian princess who became the wife of Ahab, the king of Israel. That's in 1 Kings 16, 29 to 33. 1 Kings 16, 29 to 33. Now, she was responsible for introducing a pagan religion into Israel that surpassed all the previous sins of idolatry in the northern kingdom. Idolatry in the northern kingdom, Israel, began with Jeroboam, the first king. The sin of Jeroboam was a corruption of the true religion. What he did was he set up a golden calf in Dan and Bethel, but these golden calves represented the God that brought them out of the land of Egypt. This was idolatry, but it was a corruption of the true Jehovah worship, which you find in 1 Kings 12, 25 to 23. 1 Kings 12, 25 to 23 to 33. Now, with Jezebel, it was not simply a corruption of the true religion, but she introduced a whole new God and system of worship in Israel. And that's in 1 Kings 16, 29 to 33. And through Jezebel, Baal worship came into the land, resulting in more idolatry than ever before. And involved in the worship of Baal was sexual immorality. Now, in the corruption of Jehovah worship, morality was still present. That was with Jeroboam. But in the worship of Baal, there was total immorality. Jezebel became a very real picture of what the Roman Catholic Church evolved into during the period of the Dark Ages. Roman Catholic Church introduced a paganism that resulted in idolatry and spiritual fornication. And it became a new religious system bearing little resemblance to the New Testament church. In verses 22 to 23, there is a description of the judgment of Jezebel. In verse 22, the woman is to be cast into the great tribulation. This means that unlike the true church, the Roman Catholic Church, as part of her judgment, will go into the great tribulation and will play a role during that time. Now, this is another example of a passage that simply cannot be limited to the local situation. If there really was a specific woman named Jezebel in Thyatira, she would by now be long dead and therefore would not be cast into the great tribulation. Yet the prophecy is very specific. She and her children will be cast into it. Only if Jezebel is representative of a system can this be true. Again, remember, when a woman is used symbolically, it symbolizes a religious system or entity. In verse 23, the children of Jezebel, that is, the adherents of the Roman Catholic Church, will suffer physical violence and death as part of God's judgment on Jezebel. And we have an exhortation in verses 24 to 25. This involves those who are not part of the Jezebel system and do not know the deep things of Satan. Now, the Roman Catholic Church must be viewed as Satan's counterfeit. To those who are not involved in Satan's counterfeit, they are told to hold fast to that which is pure. They are told to hold fast to the New Testament truth as over against the Roman Catholic Church system. It might not sound like a major obligation today, but in the context of the Dark Ages, it took tremendous spiritual courage and energy. Finally, in verses 26 to 29, there is the promise which is twofold. First, the one overcoming will have a part in the Messianic kingdom. In contrast to the false security of the Roman Catholic Church, they are going to have true authority over the nations during the Messianic kingdom. Second, they'll have the morning star. And here we see another figure is being used in the book of Revelation. But no, we don't need to speculate what this is, because in Revelation chapter 22, verse 16, Jesus himself is declared to be the morning star. So they will possess Jesus. The possession of the true faith presupposes a possession of the person of the Messiah. Now, it was during this period of Thyatira that 10 false doctrines were introduced into the church. Justification by works, not simply by grace through faith. Baptismal regeneration, that a person is saved by baptism. Worship of images, that's the third one. Celibacy, that was forbidding priests to marry, which was a further distinction between clergy and laity. The fifth was confessionalism, where sins are confessed to a priest who then declares absolution of those sins. And sixth, there was purgatory, which was a place of confinement, which is neither heaven nor hell, but it is some place where one has to be refined before going into heaven. And so sanctification was not complete at death. The seventh one was transubstantiation, which is the concept of the continual and perpetual sacrifice of Jesus. And eighth, we had indulgences, where through the giving of money, a person's time in purgatory could be reduced. And then we had penance, which is involving the torment of one's body in order to reduce time in purgatory. And 10th, we had Mariolatry, which is the worship of the Virgin Mary, because she was elevated as the Mother of God and the declaration of her deity. Now, all of this led to idolatry and spiritual fornication. And Jezebel in Thyatira is the Roman Catholic Church within Christendom of the Dark Ages. And this is where we shall leave it for this time. Hopefully you enjoy that, study hard and grow strong. Thank you for coming along.